The hospital loudspeakers erupted with the sharp call that made the staff freeze before springing into action. "Dr. Carter, we need you in the operating room 3 immediately for a VIP patient with a massive myocardial infarction and an emergency triple bypass." The announcement cut through the late afternoon bustle of San Francisco General with the weight of inevitability. Dr. Sienna Carter looked up from the patient charts on her desk. Her eyes stayed calm, though a flicker of unease stirred beneath her controlled expression. At 30, she was already Chief of Cardiac Surgery, a title earned through relentless nights of residency and refusing to let her hands shake when another life depended on them. "Vitals?" she asked crisply, rising from her chair before the nurse could catch up. "Critical but stable," the nurse panted, moving beside her as they navigated the crowded hall. The patient collapsed during a board meeting and was resuscitated en route.
He is Adrian Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Technologies. The name shattered through Sienna like a blade. Her stride faltered. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 9 years, yet it rang in her ears with brutal clarity. "Do you know him?" the nurse pressed. "Know him?" Sienna murmured under her breath as the floodgates opened. She had once known every contour of his smile, every cadence of his voice, every fragile hope behind the empire he built. She had also known the cruelty of the words that ended their marriage. Barren, defective, not fit to carry the Blackwell legacy. Her jaw tightened. "Forward," she told herself. "Duty first." She moved faster, her shoes striking the tiles like a drumbeat of resolve. Dr. Elena Ramirez, the chief of staff, intercepted her near the surgical wing. "Sienna, I wanted to speak with you directly. This case will draw media eyes. His family is present. You are the best we have." Sienna nodded once, though her throat had gone dry.
"What is his status?" "Blood pressure fluctuating, arrhythmia noted. Family history is severe. His grandfather had a bypass at 45, and his father died at 52. Of course, Sienna thought bitterly. She remembered every detail of Adrian's family tree. She had memorized it once when she had believed she would be part of that dynasty forever. "Who is waiting?" she asked, even though she dreaded the reply. His wife, Marina Caldwell Ramirez, said flatly. "She is demanding and has already asked for assurances." The words landed like a stone in Sienna's chest. Marina Caldwell is the replacement, chosen for her pedigree, fertility, and polished smile. The woman whose name had been whispered in gossip circles before the ink dried on divorce papers. "That does not matter," Sienna said aloud with practiced calm. "Every patient receives the same care." The doors to the scrub room opened. Nurse May Tan gestured. "OR3 is prepped. Anesthesia on standby. Perfusionist ready." Sienna entered the sterile washroom and let the water rush over her hands. Steam rose as she scrubbed and measured circles. She lifted her eyes to the reflection in the steel basin. The uncertain young woman who had once been discarded was gone. In her place stood a surgeon who commanded the trust of colleagues across the coast. She had forged this life with bloodshot eyes and aching bones, while 3 small children needed her to endure. Her thoughts flickered to them, Ava, Theo, and Miles. Their laughter had carried her through sleepless nights. Their bright eyes reminded her every day of what Adrian had called impossible. Tonight, she would not let the past weaken her because the children she raised alone depended on her strength. She pushed through the doors into OR3. The air was cool, antiseptic, filled with the steady hum of monitors. The team awaited her signal. The patient was sedated, an anesthesiologist reported, and intubated, ventilated, unstable but responsive. Sienna moved to the table and froze for a fraction of a second. Adrian Blackwell lay before her, stripped of all the arrogance and polish that had once defined him. Silver streaked his hair now, stress lines carved his features. On the table, he was not a billionaire CEO, not the man who had cast her aside, but simply another body faltering, another heart in need of her hands. "Scalpel," she commanded. The incision was clean and precise. She worked as she always did with the mechanical grace of one who had rehearsed this ritual 1,000 times. Yet tonight, every cut, every suture carried the weight of irony. The woman condemned as barren now held the future of his bloodline in her hands. The woman discarded as defective would decide whether his heart would beat again. Hours blurred into a rhythm of grafts and sutures. Veins were harvested, arteries were rerouted, and blood flow was restored. The room pulsed with tension, yet her voice remained even. Her team followed her cadence with unshakable trust. "Bypass complete," she announced at last. "Vitals stabilizing, heart function restored." "Excellent work, Dr. Carter," the resident whispered with awe. "You saved him." Sienna looked down at Adrian's unconscious face. Saved his life, yes, but nothing could revive what had been lost when he chose ambition and legacy over love. "Prepare for transfer," she ordered, removing her gloves. She stepped into the corridor, stripping away the mask. Her reflection caught in the glass of the OR door. A surgeon, forged in fire, not the broken wife of 9 years past. Nurse May approached the clipboard in her hand. "Dr. Carter, the patient's wife is insistent on updates." Sienna's lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "Of course she is. I will see her after I check the patient." Her patient, nothing more. She strode toward the ICU, each step steady, though something profound within her stirred. The past had returned, not with whispers, but with a blaring code red and a man's failing heart. She had saved Adrian Blackwell tonight. Tomorrow she would have to face him, and when he opened his eyes, he would not see the woman he had once called barren. He would see the surgeon who held his second chance in her hands. That thought both strengthened and unsettled her, for this was not the end of the story. It was the opening incision, and the most challenging part of the procedure had yet to begin. 9 years earlier, the Blackwell mansion in Pacific Heights gleamed with a cold perfection that had never felt like home. Its marble floors echoed silently, and its walls were lined with art chosen for value, not sentiment. Dr. Sienna Carter, still Sienna Blackwell, sat in the cavernous living room, staring at the small plastic stick trembling in her hands. Another negative test, the 15th in 3 years. The click broke the silence of polished shoes on marble. Adrian Blackwell emerged from his office, his Armani suit sharp and his expression sharper still. He filled the doorway with his tall frame, and colder than the San Francisco fog, his voice cut through her fragile hope. "How many this time?" he asked, though his tone already betrayed disinterest. 15, Sienna whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. Adrian adjusted his cufflinks with precise annoyance. 3 years, Sienna. 3 years of doctor's treatments, specialists' injections. At what point do we accept the truth? She forced herself to look up, her eyes already glistening. "The doctor said my hormone levels are improving. The new treatment could help." His laugh was soft and merciless. "We have tried for 3 years. It may be time to accept that you cannot give me what I need." The words struck like physical blows. She had loved this man through every disappointment, every miscarriage, every cruel headline speculating on the absence of an heir. She remembered the nights he held her, whispering promises they would endure together. That man seemed a ghost now. "What you need, Sienna," repeated her voice, breaking. "What about what we need? Our marriage, our love?" He said that love does not preserve a legacy, smoothly pouring himself a drink from the bar cart. "Love does not provide heirs for the company my great-grandfather built." "I am your wife," Sienna said, rising to her feet and her body trembling. "I am not just some vessel for your dynasty." "You are supposed to be both," he replied, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. "My grandmother was right. I should have married someone from our circle, with a proven family line." "Your grandmother never wanted me," Sienna said, her voice rising with anger. "She hated that my father was a mechanic, and my mother a teacher. She hated that I was not from old money. And now you stand here repeating her words like a puppet." He turned away from her, his hand steady on the glass of scotch. "Veronica Patterson is already expecting. Jennifer Ashworth just gave birth to twins. Even Patricia Melbourne is pregnant again." Each name cut deeper. These were the women his family had paraded before him, the society heiresses, polished and pedigreed. Women Sienna had always been compared to, women she had once believed he had chosen her over. "So that is it," she whispered, 3 years of marriage reduced to my inability to conceive. "It is not personal," Adrian said, his voice flat and clinical. "Not personal." Her laugh was brittle with disbelief. "You are ending our marriage because I cannot have children, and you call that not personal." He faced her at last, his expression devoid of warmth. "You are a beautiful, intelligent woman. Someone else will love you for who you are, but I need more." Defective goods he had once promised to love forever, and now his words condemned her as broken. "Get out," she whispered. "Sienna," he began.
"Get out!" she screamed, her voice echoing against the marble walls. "Out of this room, out of my sight. Do not touch me. Do not pretend you care." He set his glass down carefully and straightened his tie. "My lawyer will contact you tomorrow. I will be generous in the settlement." "I do not want your money," she spat. "You will take it. You will need it to start over." Her vision blurred with tears as he turned toward the door. His voice was calm and businesslike. "I have already spoken to Marina Caldwell. We will announce our engagement next month." Her knees weakened. "You already chose my replacement." He said with ruthless finality, "I chose someone who can give me what I need." The sound of the door closing behind him was the sound of her heart fracturing. Minutes later, the growl of his car engine faded into the night, leaving her in silence with nothing but the shattered remains of their vows.
3 weeks later, Sienna sat in a sterile law office, her signature shaking on the divorce papers. Adrian had not even bothered to appear. His attorney handled the transaction as if she were nothing more than a contract to be dissolved. She returned to her small rented apartment, hollowed out by grief. For days she could not eat or sleep. Her body felt like a graveyard of failures, and then the nausea began. She crouched on the bathroom floor, clutching a pregnancy test with trembling hands. The 2 pink lines stared back at her through tears of disbelief. After years of negative results and years of despair, her body had finally done the impossible. She was carrying Adrian Blackwell's child. Her sobs shook the walls, equal parts joy and devastation. She had lost him, but she had not lost everything. Inside her beat 3 small hearts, the miracle he had declared she would never give him. At that moment, she swore that those children would never know rejection. They would never hear the word defective spoken over them. She would raise them alone if she had to, and raise them strong. Outside, the rain fell against the city windows like the closing of a chapter. Inside, Sienna pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling a fragile flicker of hope for the first time in years. 9 years later, that hope would walk hospital hallways with curly hair, stubborn chins, and brilliant eyes. And the man who had once condemned her would lie helpless on her table as she decided whether his heart deserved to beat again. The operating theater had fallen silent after the storm of the surgery, but in Sienna's chest the storm still raged. Hours had passed since she had sutured the final graft, yet the weight of what she had done pressed heavier than lead. She had saved Adrian Blackwell's life. She had held his heart in her hands, steady and unyielding, while every buried memory clawed to the surface. She stripped off her surgical gown and scrubbed again until her skin was raw. She did not want the feel of him clinging to her palms. The irony gnawed at her. 9 years ago, he had declared her worthless because she could not carry children, and now she had given him a second chance at life with those same hands that had once begged for his comfort. The hospital corridor stretched long and cold. Nurses rushed by with clipboards. Paramedics wheeled gurneys, but to Sienna, the hallway felt like the passage between 2 lives. On one side, the woman she had once been, the discarded wife; on the other side, the surgeon she had become. Yet the 2 refused to remain separate. His name echoed down both. Dr. Carter, Elena Ramirez's voice called her back to the present. The chief of staff approached her with brisk steps, her face composed yet serious. "We need to talk about this case." Sienna lifted her chin, masking the turmoil within. "He is stable. The bypass was clean and the grafts are holding. I know, your skill is not in question, but his identity is. You operated on your ex-husband. That alone raises concerns. The ethics board will ask questions about conflicts of interest." Sienna's lips tightened. He was coding. There was no time to debate ethics while his heart failed on the table. Ramirez studied her face. "I am not questioning your decision at the moment. I would have made the same call. But understand me, Sienna, this will not end in the OR. Blackwell is high profile. His company, family, money, and the press will circle like vultures. When the story breaks that his ex-wife performed the surgery, we need to be ready. Sienna forced a breath through her lungs. I did my duty. That is all anyone needs to know. Duty is rarely enough when the public is hungry for scandal, Ramirez said quietly. The words lingered after she walked away. Duty, memory. They bled together until Sienna no longer knew where one ended and the other began. She turned down another corridor, heading toward the ICU. Nurses were already settling Adrian into a private room fit for a man of his status. Machines beeped softly around him, tethering him to life. He looked older, more fragile, but still dangerously familiar. She pressed her palms to the cool glass of the observation window. This was supposed to be just another patient. But nothing about Adrian Blackwell could ever be just another anything. Behind her, Nurse May approached cautiously. Dr. Carter, Mrs. Caldwell is waiting. She insists on updates. Sienna's jaw tightened. Of course she is. Marina Caldwell swept into view moments later, gliding down the corridor like she owned it. Her blonde hair was immaculate, and her diamonds caught the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked every inch the society wife chosen for display and function. Her gaze flicked over Sienna with cool disinterest. "Are you the surgeon?" she asked, though the words sounded more like an accusation. "I am Dr. Sienna Carter, Chief of Cardiac Surgery. I performed your husband's operation." "My husband," Marina emphasized the word as if to stake her claim. "How long before he can resume work?" Sienna met her gaze evenly. "He underwent a triple bypass. He will require at least 6 weeks of recovery and cardiac rehabilitation." 2 months is impossible, Marina snapped. "He has a product launch and the Caldwell Foundation Gala next month. Your husband nearly died this afternoon. If he returns to work too soon, he will." Marina's eyes narrowed. "Do you know who he is, doctor?" "Yes," Sienna said softly, her voice edged with steel. "I know exactly who he is." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Marina's face. The name Carter seemed to ring faintly in her mind, but she dismissed it quickly. "Very well, but I expect daily updates. My husband is not just any man." No, Sienna thought as Marina turned away. He is not. He is the man who once held my heart like glass and shattered it without remorse. The corridor emptied again, leaving Sienna with the steady rhythm of machines behind the glass. She pressed her forehead against the cool surface and closed her eyes. Tomorrow he would wake. Tomorrow she would have to look into the eyes that once condemned her and see if they still held the same merciless judgment. Later that night, she walked home through the fog that rolled in from the bay. The city lights blurred into halos of gold. At her apartment door, she paused listening. From inside came the sound of laughter, high and sweet. She stepped in and was immediately surrounded by 3 small whirlwinds. Ava's sketchbook was smudged with pastel colors. Theo, with his latest book of riddles tucked under his arm. Miles had solemn, thoughtful eyes that always seemed to see too much. Mom Ava cried, throwing her arms around her waist. "You are late." Sienna hugged her daughter tightly, drinking in the scent of crayons and shampoo. "The surgery ran long, sweetheart. Did you save someone again?" Theo asked, his voice full of curiosity. "Yes," Sienna whispered, her throat tightening. "I saved someone." Miles tilted his head, studying her face. "You look sad." "Not sad," she said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But inside, she knew sadness was only half of it. The other half was fear. Fear of the man lying in the ICU. Fear of the truth she had carried alone for 8 years. Fear of what would happen when past and present finally collided. She tucked the children into bed, their faces peaceful in the glow of night lights. She lingered at their doors listening to their even breaths. They were her world, her miracle, her reason for every long hour. And now their father was back within reach, though he did not know it. Not yet. Sienna sat at her desk long into the night, the weight of medical reports before her, and the heavier weight of memory pressing behind her eyes. She had built a fortress around her life, brick by brick of duty and discipline. But tonight, she felt the first crack. The line between duty and memory had blurred, and she knew tomorrow that line would vanish completely when Adrian Blackwell opened his eyes. Dawn crept over the city like a careful hand drawing light across glass, while the cardiac intensive care unit sighed with the steady language of machines. Sienna stood outside the window of the private room and studied the monitors with the calm attention she had taught herself to wear like armor. Heart rate steady, blood pressure holding, oxygenation sound. The bypass grafts were doing their quiet work, and for a moment medicine felt simple again, measurable and obedient. Nurse Olivia Park adjusted an infusion and gave a slight nod, asking without speaking whether the attending wished to go in. Sienna answered with motion instead of words. She sanitized her hands and entered the room where the man who had once defined her past now depended on the present tense of her training. Adrian rested with eyes closed under the soft whir of the ventilator. The endotracheal tube had been removed at the close of surgery and replaced with supplemental oxygen. Lines threaded like careful sentences across his body, telling a story of shock, rescue, and return. In the room's bright white, the details of power and position fell away. What remained was a patient who had survived a crisis, and a surgeon responsible for shepherding him to a safer shore. Sienna performed the ritual she had repeated hundreds of times. Pupillary response is brisk. Distal pulses are intense. Lung sounds clear. The sternotomy site is clean and dry. She spoke each note for the chart and for her own discipline. Professional language built walls high enough to contain the past. Outside the glass, a familiar reflection approached. Elena Ramirez stepped in with a folder tucked beneath her arm and a face that signaled support and scrutiny. She stood beside Sienna and kept her voice low. The night team reports excellent stability. Media inquiries began an hour ago. Public Relations has a holding statement that cites privacy and thanks the surgical service while naming no one. Sienna kept her focus on the patient. Thank you. The ethics review already initiated, said Ramirez. I have logged the timeline and your decision tree. You were the only surgeon available with the requisite skill when he arrived. The record shows an apparent necessity. Even so, another attending will co-manage from this point to avoid any suggestion of impropriety. Dr. Patel has accepted and will round with you this morning. That is appropriate, said Sienna. She felt the relief of a structure capable of bearing weight. Protocol is a shelter when memory is a storm. They watched the monitors together while the light outside lifted from pearl to gold. After a long minute, Ramirez added one more piece of information. His wife has requested to see you personally. She is in the family room. I recommend concise language and firm boundaries. Sienna inclined her head. Boundaries were the instruments sharper than any scalpel. She stepped out and allowed Nurse Olivia to continue care while she walked the brief corridor toward the room, where families waited with coffee that cooled too quickly and hope that cooled more slowly. Marina Caldwell sat upright in a chair as if the furniture might learn posture from her. Even fatigue could not dull the precision of her appearance. She looked up when Sienna entered and fixed her with an evaluating gaze that flickered through recognition and back to control. Sienna introduced herself with the same even cadence she used with every family. She summarized the procedure, the grafts, the current stability, the plan for rehabilitation, the strict prohibition on stress, and the timelines that ignored human bodies. Marina listened without interrupting until the final sentence. She asked how soon he could return to work, and Sienna gave an answer measured in weeks, not days. Marina countered that he carried responsibilities that could not wait. Sienna replied that the heart does not negotiate. There was a quiet moment, then a thin smile that conceded nothing and everything at once. Marina thanked the doctor with superb manners and asked to be called when he woke. When Sienna returned to the room, Adrian's eyelids were beginning to move under the slow weight of sedation, leaving. She stood at the foot of the bed with the chart in her hands and waited while consciousness gathered. His lashes lifted and his eyes found the ceiling and then found her. The recognition was a slight, visible shiver that ran through him and registered on the monitor as a gentle climb. He tried to speak and she raised a hand for quiet. She told him to take slow breaths. She gave the simple orientation every patient deserves. He was in the cardiac unit. He had suffered an infarction. A triple bypass had been performed. His vital signs were stable. He was safe. Each sentence placed a stone on the path from fear to understanding. Gratitude moved across his face like a tide. His lips formed words he did not need to say. She answered as she would answer any patient. The team did its work. The rest is the next operation. And he holds the principal instrument. He looked at her as if to say more, and Sienna felt the old landscape rise like distant mountains. She redirected him toward the present. She asked about pain. She adjusted his pillows. She reminded him of the incentive spirometer and supervised 2 tentative breaths. The monitor softened again. The moment passed without injury. Dr. Arjun Patel entered with easy energy and brought a different temperature to the room. He greeted Sienna with professional warmth and greeted the patient with the calm of a physician who had guided many recoveries. They reviewed labs and imaging and then reviewed the plan at the bedside so the patient could hear the commitment in the structure. Dual antiplatelet therapy, beta blockade as tolerated, early mobilization. Education begins today. No visitors beyond immediate family during the first 24 hours. Patel asked if the patient had any immediate concerns. Adrian looked at Sienna and then said that he would follow the instructions. Patel nodded and added that trust is part of the therapy. He said it without irony, and its simplicity settled in the room like a clean sheet. When they stepped into the hall, Patel lowered his voice. He said he had spoken with Ramirez and understood the history. He thanked Sienna for looping him in early and said he would take point on family updates if she preferred. Sienna considered the offer. She accepted for the first day and reserved the right to resume later. Patel agreed without hesitation. Collaboration is the cure for scrutiny as well as illness. The morning widened. Rounds moved like a quietly turning wheel. Orders were written, labs returned, medications adjusted. Each small action pulled the crisis further into the past. Sienna felt her breathing match the metronome of the floor. Before noon, she returned to the family room. Marina rose as if on springs. Sienna reported the patient was awake and stable and would be allowed a brief visit. She explained the rules: no agitation, no business discussion, no demands for timelines beyond those already given. Marina accepted with a glance that promised an argument later, and followed Sienna down the corridor. At the doorway, Sienna paused. She asked Marina to wait one breath so she could center the patient. Inside, she adjusted the bed angle and confirmed comfort. She told Adrian that his wife would enter. She watched his expression become polite and contained. Then she stepped aside and allowed a scene to play that was not hers to direct. Marina crossed the threshold with a smile shaped more by cameras than by love. She greeted him, placed the back of her hand against his cheek, and assessed him as she might assess a rare piece of art for flaws in restoration. She thanked the medical team in a tone that carried to the hallway, and then began to sketch the schedule he would return to. Sienna stepped in gently to redirect. She translated the schedule into weeks and not days. Marina's smile thinned like paper in the rain. After several minutes, Sienna ended the visit. She cited fatigue and hewing to protocol. Marina accepted with visible effort and left with a promise to return in the evening. As she moved past Sienna, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was a question there that neither of them asked. Recognition hovered like a scent. The afternoon brought the quieter work of recovery. Breathing exercises, ice chips, short sentences that measured endurance. Sienna stopped in 3 times and kept her language inside the safe harbor of medicine each time. Adrian answered with gratitude and the discipline of a man used to winning through effort. He asked nothing about the past, and she offered nothing. The unsaid collected between them like rain held back by eaves. Late afternoon, Ramirez called a brief meeting in a conference room near the unit. Sienna joined Patel and 2 nurse leads while a liaison from public relations dialed in from another floor. They reviewed the talking points that said many things and revealed nothing. They confirmed that the hospital would not address relationships among staff and patients beyond the assurance that care met the highest standards. They agreed that any further questions would be routed through a single channel. The moment the call ended, the room felt lighter, and agreement is a kind of medicine. When Sienna returned to the unit, she found Nurse Olivia coaching Adrian through the first sit at the edge of the bed. The movement was awkward and triumphant. Pain etched his face, and pride steadied his hands. Sienna stood where he could see her without turning, and asked if the world felt steady. He nodded and said it did. She allowed herself the smallest smile, and he allowed himself to return it. Evening settled. The monitors dimmed to their night palettes. The unit took on the hush when bodies remembered they were meant to sleep. Sienna wrote her final notes at the workstation just outside his room. She chose each word carefully, as if language could hold a sternum together. She signed the orders and then looked through the glass one more time. He had closed his eyes again. The lines on his face seemed less like calculations and more like maps. For the first time since the pager had called, she let herself feel the whole shape of the day. She had acted in duty. She had asked for oversight. She had guarded the boundaries that keep surgeons from drowning in their histories. She gathered her things and walked toward the staff exit. Fog pressed against the windows like a patient waiting to be called. On the way out, she sent a brief message to the sitter who had collected the children from school. She thanked Mrs. Lee and promised pancakes in the morning. Ava would want to show a new charcoal study. Theo would have questions about oxygen saturation curves. Miles would ask if hearts remember. Sienna stepped into the cool corridor that led to the elevator. Behind him, the unit hummed. Ahead of her, the night opened. Between those spaces stretched the threshold she had crossed all day without falling. Duty on one side, memory on the other hand. She inhaled and let the air settle in her ribs. In the morning, the work would begin again with rounds and numbers and the careful discipline of healing. Adrian would be stronger in the morning, and the questions would be louder. She would meet both with the same steady hands she had brought to the operating table. She would continue to build the future that had grown in defiance of judgment. For now, she pressed the elevator button and watched the light blink. Proof lived in the chart. Proof lived in the rhythm on the screen. Proof lived in the simple fact that a failed heart now beat. That was enough for tonight. Morning returned with the pale insistence of light filtering through the tall hospital windows. The cardiac unit stirred awake, monitors beeping in uneven chorus, while nurses moved briskly between rooms with trays of medications and charts balanced like offerings. Sienna entered at shift change, her white coat already bearing the quiet discipline of a long career that had taught her how to steady chaos into order. She greeted the night team, reviewed their reports, and then moved toward the private suite where Adrian was recovering. Through the glare, she saw him sitting upright in bed, an oxygen cannula resting against his face, hands folded in a way that spoke less of calm and more of tension disguised as composure. Marina sat beside him, her posture immaculate, though her eyes betrayed impatience at the slow rhythm of convalescence. A file of board reports lay unopened on the table beside her, brought not as reading material, but as a reminder of what waited beyond these walls. Sienna entered with her chart and performed the same sequence she had refined to ritual. Vitals reviewed, heart sounds auscultated, sternotomy site examined. She explained the plan for the day: mobilization to the chair, breathing exercises every hour, and slow progress toward independence. Adrian listened with careful attention, nodding at each instruction. His eyes lingered on her with a weight that Marina noticed. Marina's expression cooled, though her smile never faltered. When Sienna finished, she asked if there were any questions. Adrian asked only about the steps necessary for full recovery. Marina asked about discharge. The surgeon answered each with precision. Weeks, not days. Lifestyle changes are not optional. Stress reduction is a prescription that is as vital as medication. Marina pressed again, her voice edged with impatience. Sienna remained unshaken. Bodies are not bound to corporate calendars. Biology does not bend to gala schedules. The truth left no space for negotiation. Later, in the staff lounge, Sienna found Dr. Patel reviewing patient notes. He looked up with a half smile. "You held the line," he said. She answered that the line holds itself if you speak the facts clearly enough. He studied her face, sensing the guarded walls she built around herself. He asked quietly whether she was managing the personal dimension. She reminded him that the patient is every surgeon's history once they are under the knife, nothing more. Patel accepted the statement but left space for her to add more if she wished. She did not. Midday arrived with its flood of family visits. Marina returned with a small entourage of associates who waited in the hallway. Sienna intercepted them and restricted entry to one visitor at a time. Marina bristled, but protocol stood. She entered alone, leaving the entourage to whisper among themselves about succession and board votes. Sienna watched through the glass as Marina leaned close to Adrian, her words urgent, her gestures sharp. He listened, but his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of obligations he could not carry. When Marina left, she passed Sienna without comment, her heels striking the floor like punctuation. Hours later came the moment that unsettled Sienna's carefully constructed day. She was reviewing imaging at the nurse's station when 3 children appeared at the end of the corridor, ushered by a familiar neighbor. Ava, with her sketchbook hugged to her chest. Theo is carrying a backpack bulging with textbooks. Miles had a storybook tucked under one arm and a quiet look that saw more than his age should allow. They spotted their mother instantly and ran forward. Mrs. Lee explained she had brought them from school because her grandson was delayed. Sienna thanked her and knelt to embrace the children, their voices rising with excitement, their presence filling the sterile corridor with life. But when Sienna lifted her eyes, he saw through the glass that Adrian had turned toward the sound. His face, pale from surgery, shifted as recognition sparked across it. His gaze fixed on the 3 children. His hand gripped the blanket. The monitor ticked upward in rhythm with a truth dawning too fast. He saw in Ava the reflection of his own stubborn eyes. In Theo, the analytical curiosity that had once defined him. In Miles, the gentle patience of a man he could have been. Sienna felt the moment collapse into inevitability. She ushered the children toward the lounge, but not before Adrian's eyes followed them, heavy with realization. Inside the room, the nurse hurried to adjust medication, thinking the spike in vitals was pain. Sienna entered and steadied the patient calmly, telling him to breathe and let the monitor guide him back down. He obeyed, but his gaze did not release hers. When Marina returned minutes later, he had already composed himself, though the knowledge remained behind his eyes like a shadow across glass. Marina saw none, speaking instead about public statements and planned appearances. Sienna kept her silence, though her heart thundered louder than the machines. Evening fell. The children went home with their sitter. The unit settled into its nocturnal rhythm. Sienna finished her notes and stood at the glass again, watching Adrian drift asleep. The shadows of the monitors stretched long across the room. She knew the reckoning had begun. She knew that silence could not hold much longer. The truth had brushed the edge of discovery, and truth never waits patiently once it has glimpsed the light. She left the hospital with the night pressing cool against her skin. In her bag, the sketchbook Ava had thrust into her hands waited to be admired at home. A charcoal drawing of a heart wrapped in roots filled one page, uncanny in its accuracy. Miles had tucked a note in the margins that read simply, "Hearts remember." Theo had scribbled equations on the back of a napkin, convinced that rhythm could be solved like mathematics. They carried pieces of their father in ways none of them understood. And now the man himself had begun to see it. The city streets hummed with ordinary life as Sienna walked to her car. But inside her chest, the knowledge echoed. Tomorrow, the questions would come. Tomorrow, the boundaries she had guarded would be tested. Tomorrow, proof will no longer be a concept, but a consequence. The second morning of Adrian's recovery arrived, fog pressing against the hospital windows, and the muted clang of service carts rolling down polished corridors. The cardiac unit was quieter than the day before, yet tension lingered like static in the air. Sienna moved with deliberate calm, carrying her charts and the weight of decisions that could not remain silent forever. She began with routine. Lab results first, then rounds with Dr. Patel and the nursing staff. They reviewed medications, noted steady rhythms, and adjusted dosages. Everything appeared stable, but stability in medicine was never a guarantee. Recovery was fragile, like glass that seemed whole yet bore invisible cracks. Adrian was compliant, following instructions with the focus of a man who understood his body was now both ally and enemy. He answered questions politely, but his gaze often lingered on Sienna, as if measuring unspoken truths. Marina arrived mid-morning, dressed immaculately despite the early hour. She carried a tablet filled with schedules and reminded her husband of obligations awaiting him outside. Sienna intercepted, outlining with clinical certainty the dangers of premature exertion. Weeks, not days. Therapy, not boardrooms. Marina pushed back, but Adrian surprised them both by siding with the medical plan. His voice was quiet but firm. For once, he deferred to care rather than commerce. Marina's eyes narrowed, suspicion rippling beneath her polished exterior. After she left, Adrian requested a moment alone with Sienna. She hesitated, then agreed. The room closed around them with its beeping monitors and sterile light. He asked about the children he had glimpsed the day before. His tone was not accusatory, but the question carried the force of recognition. He described their faces, the familiarity that struck him like a blow, the certainty that no coincidence could explain. Were they his? The silence between them thickened. Sienna kept her professional mask in place, but felt the walls inside her trembling. She reminded him that his health must come first, that stress could undo every stitch, every graft. He pressed again. She deflected once more and left the room with her pulse racing. Administrative meetings consumed the afternoon. Hospital leadership convened to address media interest. The ethics committee confirmed protocol had been followed, though conflict of interest monitoring would remain. Dr. Patel volunteered to manage family updates going forward. Sienna accepted, though she knew she could not sidestep the truth indefinitely. Protocol protected careers. It did not shield hearts. Later that day, the children returned with their sitter. Ava carried her sketchbook. Theo recited details about science homework, and Miles clutched a library book about constellations. They waited in the family lounge, unaware of the storm brewing beyond the walls. Sienna hugged them tightly, breathing in their ordinary chatter like oxygen. Yet she could not ignore Adrian's glance through the glass when the children passed. He had already begun to connect pieces she had hidden for 8 years. Evening brought another confrontation. Marina returned, sharp with suspicion. She asked why the children of a surgeon had been allowed so near the ward, hinting at impropriety. Her words dripped with accusation cloaked as concern. Sienna met the challenge with clinical detachment, explaining that physicians often balanced professional duty with parental responsibility. Marina did not appear convinced. She pressed harder, asking why her husband's vital signs had spiked during the previous day's commotion. Sienna answered with neutral precision. Anxiety and exertion are common in recovery. Marina's eyes lingered longer than necessary, searching for cracks in the facade. When night fell, Sienna retreated to her office. She laid Ava's sketchbook open on the desk and stared at the drawing of a heart wrapped in roots. It mirrored everything she felt, a life built around fragility, strength hidden within scars, connections that could not be severed even when buried. She touched the page as though it were a pulse. She knew Adrian's questions would return with greater force tomorrow. She knew Marina's suspicions would sharpen, and she knew her children, innocent in their clarity, would eventually demand answers. The proof of concept she had lived by, discipline, silence, control, was beginning to fracture. Medicine could stitch arteries, reroute blood, mend what was broken. But no scalpel could prevent truth from surfacing once it had been glimpsed. The fractures beneath the surface were widening, and soon all the boundaries she had built would be tested. Morning descended like a quiet reckoning. The hospital corridors hushed except for the soft rhythm of footsteps and the muted alarm of monitors demanding attention. Sienna moved deliberately through the cardiac unit, her clipboard in hand, her composure intact, though beneath it a storm brewed with every step.
The routine pattern remained unchanged, yet every glance toward Adrian's room reminded her that routine would not hold for much longer. She entered the suite to find him sitting in bed, posture straighter than the day before, determination written into every controlled breath. His eyes followed her the moment she appeared, not with hostility, but with a gravity that drew her nearer. She checked his vitals, examined the surgical site, adjusted his oxygen, and all the while felt his gaze unrelenting. Finally, he spoke, voice low but steady, asking again about the children he had seen. The way he said it left no room for pretenses. He already knew. He sought confirmation. Sienna maintained her clinical tone, repeating that stress was his most significant risk, and that questions of family must wait until recovery stabilized. But Adrian pressed forward, describing the uncanny familiarity of their faces, gestures, even their names he had overheard. Ava's sharp observations mirrored his own childhood curiosity. Theo's precision with numbers was a mirror of his early schooling.
Miles's gentleness recalled the brother he had once lost. He recited these details like evidence laid before a court. The monitors recorded his heart rate climbing, though not dangerously, which was a visible measure of his urgency. She calmed him with instruction, but within herself, she knew silence was beginning to lose its power. That afternoon, Dr. Patel arrived for rounds, bringing warmth into the room. He spoke of medication adjustments and emphasized walking exercises to strengthen circulation. Adrian complied, though his focus drifted back to Sienna after each instruction. When Patel asked about his concerns, Adrian answered no, yet his eyes told another story. Patel glanced between them but said nothing, respecting a boundary he could sense, though not name. The tension found another form later when Marina entered. Her arrival was like glass striking marble, sharp and unmistakable. She carried news of upcoming galas and board meetings, speaking as if business deadlines were more urgent than healing arteries. When Sienna repeated the prohibition on stress, Marina's composure cracked slightly. She turned her sharp gaze on the surgeon, questioning her authority with veiled comments. Sienna replied with measured clarity. The heart has no regard for social calendars. Recovery requires obedience to biology, not ambition. The words left Marina visibly displeased. After Marina's departure, Adrian asked quietly whether she was always so unyielding. Sienna replied that healing does not bargain, not even with billionaires. He studied her then, searching for the woman he had known years ago beneath the surgeon's armor. She did not meet his gaze, focusing instead on the chart. She left the room swiftly, her heart beating harder than the monitors behind her. Evening arrived with its quieter shadows. The children were waiting in the family lounge, their schoolwork spread across the table, their chatter filling the sterile space with warmth. Ava showed her mother a new sketch of tree branches breaking through stone. Theo demonstrated a math puzzle he had solved. Proud of his logic, Miles read softly from a story about stars guiding lost travelers home. Sienna embraced them, but her chest ached at the knowledge that their father was only doors away, sensing their existence but still barred from it. Proof of concept had once been silence, control, and structure, yet, in their bright eyes and eager voices, proof lived in flesh and bone, undeniable. She escorted them out with their sitter and glanced back toward the ward. Adrian had stepped into the hallway with assistance, taking his first cautious walk. He saw the children departing, and though he said nothing, his expression carried the weight of recognition, sorrow, and a longing that no medical protocol could heal. The silence between what was known and spoken stretched thin, ready to fracture. That night in her office, Sienna sat with Ava's sketchbook open before her, the charcoal image of roots splitting stone haunting in its resonance. Miles's quiet words about stars echoed in her mind. Theo's equations remained scribbled on a crumpled sheet, proof that logic and truth demand resolution. The children carried evidence she could no longer conceal. The man recovering down the corridor carried questions she could no longer deflect. Proof was no longer a concept, proof was inevitable. And as the lights dimmed across the hospital, Sienna understood that the edge of disclosure was nearer than ever. One more day, perhaps two, and silence would not hold. What had once been hidden in discipline and duty was now pressing toward the surface with the unstoppable force of blood seeking its course. The third day of recovery began with the sterile glow of monitors and the sharp scent of antiseptic drifting across the unit. Nurses adjusted IV lines, respiratory therapists coached patients through breathing exercises, and the entire ward carried the steady hum of cautious progress. Yet beneath the clinical rhythm, Sienna felt the tremor of inevitability pressing harder with each passing hour. The truth she had held behind locked doors was knocking louder, demanding entry. Adrian was stronger now, his body knitting itself back together under the watch of surgeons and nurses. He managed short walks down the corridor, supported by staff, his stride halting but purposeful. Each step was an act of reclamation, but his eyes betrayed where his mind wandered. They searched beyond the ward, beyond his chart, toward the memory of 3 children whose faces mirrored his own. Every time he looked at Sienna, the questions sharpened. The silence between them was no longer protective. It was corrosive. Morning rounds with Dr. Patel offered a brief shield. They reviewed labs, adjusted medications, and discussed the rehabilitation plan. Adrian listened, but contributed little. His focus remained fixed on something larger, heavier, something that lived in the space between his breaths. Patel noticed, his gaze flicking between patient and surgeon, but he chose not to intrude. The unspoken has its own gravity, and even colleagues respect its orbit. When Marina arrived mid-morning, the atmosphere shifted like glass under stress. She carried flowers in precise arrangements and news of board decisions that had been postponed due to his illness. She urged him to return to leadership quickly. Her voice was tinged with irritation that biology moved at its own pace. Adrian answered with unusual restraint, telling her he would follow the doctor's orders. Her eyes narrowed at the subtle defiance. The silence between husband and wife was thick but different, forged not from secrets, but from the absence of real connection. Later that day, Sienna found her children waiting again in the family lounge. Ava worked on another sketch, a heart surrounded by fractured glass that remained intact. Theo solved equations on scrap paper, explaining to Miles how numbers could predict the path of planets. Miles read aloud from a book about travelers searching for a home they had lost. Their ordinary brightness filled Sienna with both pride and dread. Proof of life, proof of lineage, proof she could not hide much longer. She hugged them tightly, but her gaze flicked toward the ward, knowing Adrian's awareness was already too keen. During an afternoon walk, the line between suspicion and recognition fractured. With a nurse supporting him, Adrian rounded the corner of the corridor and caught sight of Ava through the lounge window. She had tilted her sketchbook against the glass, showing her brothers a drawing of roots breaking stone. Adrian froze. The resemblance in her profile was undeniable. His breath quickened, his chest rising with effort as monitors beeped warningly. The nurse urged him back to bed, but his eyes remained locked on the children. The silence had shattered. Proof had announced itself. Back in his room, he waited until Sienna entered. His voice was hoarse but deliberate. He asked again, this time not as a question, but as a demand shaped by desperation. Were they his children? Sienna hesitated, professional mask slipping for a heartbeat before she regained control. She told him to focus on recovery, that emotions could jeopardize healing. But Adrian pressed harder. He described their faces, their voices, the way Ava's eyes carried his own reflection. His tone was no longer curiosity but certainty. The proof was in their existence. She could not deny what blood and bone had already declared. Evening fell heavily. Marina returned, speaking of galas and obligations, unaware of the storm gathering in her husband's mind. She noticed his distraction and questioned his silence, but received no honest answer. Sienna stood in the background, chart in hand, feeling the fracture lines spread through every layer of her carefully constructed world. Marina's suspicions grew sharper, her gaze lingering too long on the surgeon, her words edged with veiled hostility. The battle lines were forming, though the war had not yet been named. That night, alone in her office, Sienna opened Ava's sketchbook again. She studied the drawing of fractured glass, holding firm and feeling its truth resonate. Her children were strong, resilient, and whole despite the cracks in their origin story. But strength could not shield them from what was coming. Proof was no longer a concept. It had stepped into the light of recognition. Tomorrow or the next day, disclosure would no longer be a choice. It would be demanded, and when it came, the lives of everyone involved would be altered beyond recall. The fourth recovery day dawned with the same muted rhythm of machines and careful footsteps. Yet, the atmosphere around the private suite felt different, heavier, as if the walls were bracing for impact. Nurses carried trays of medication, respiratory therapists encouraged breathing exercises, and the ordinary rituals of the cardiac ward continued. But beneath the structure of medicine, a more volatile current was beginning to surge. Adrian had grown stronger, his color returning, his movements steadier. Each lap he made down the corridor with staff assistance lengthened his endurance. Yet each step was less about rebuilding muscle and more about preparing for a confrontation he could no longer postpone. His eyes followed every detail, searching the ward, waiting for the children he had glimpsed before, memorizing their faces in his absence. He was no longer a man content with suspicions. He was a man ready to demand the truth. Sienna entered his room with a chart in hand, her manner the embodiment of professionalism. She checked his vitals, noted his progress, and adjusted medications. She kept her words precise, her tone calm. But Adrian broke through the clinical script with one deliberate question. Were the 3 children his? This time, his voice carried no uncertainty, only demand. The monitor registered his elevated pulse, though not yet dangerous. Silence stretched across the room like glass bending under pressure. Finally, she told him to focus on breathing, to lower his heart rate, and to let the grafts heal. But her deflection only deepened his certainty. The truth was written in her hesitation. Later, Marina returned, immaculate as always, carrying another wave of schedules and obligations. She urged him to prepare for public appearances and board meetings that could not be delayed. Adrian listened, but when he responded, his tone was sharper. He would recover on his own terms. Marina's eyes flashed with suspicion. She asked why his attention seemed divided, why he stared so often out the glass toward the hallway. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Sienna, then back to her husband, suspicion tightening around her like a net. Sienna excused herself with clinical detachment, leaving husband and wife to their brittle exchange. The afternoon brought the fracture closer to breaking. The children appeared again, led quietly by their sitter, to the family lounge. Ava sketched, Theo explained science riddles, and Miles read softly about constellations. Their presence illuminated the sterile room with warmth, but their voices carried down the corridor. Sitting in a chair for his exercises, Adrian froze at the sound. He rose with help, walking toward the lounge window, his eyes fastening on them with undeniable recognition. The nurse urged him back, but he remained long enough for his certainty to harden into proof. No amount of silence could erase what blood had written across their faces. That evening, he confronted Sienna again. Alone in the room, his words came steady despite the weight on his chest. He described their resemblance in detail, every echo of himself in them. He demanded not to be lied to. She tried once more to remind him of his fragile condition, to press the argument of stress and risk. But he cut through her defenses, telling her survival meant nothing if the truth was denied. His voice faltered only when he spoke of regret, of choices made in arrogance that had broken something irretrievable. For the first time, she saw him not as a powerful executive, but as a man undone by the consequences of his own cruelty. Sienna left the room with her composure intact. Yet inside her chest, everything cracked. She walked the corridor past the lounge where her children laughed unaware, past the staff desk where Patel studied charts, past the glass where Marina watched like a hawk. Proof of concept had once been discipline and silence, a belief that boundaries could protect what mattered most. But now proof had transformed into consequence. The secret she had guarded for 8 years was no longer a concept. It was an alive, undeniable, demanding voice. That night in her office, she opened Ava's latest sketch. A heart stood in the center, fractured by jagged lines but still pulsing, still whole. Around it, roots spread outward, connecting everything. Sienna traced the lines with her finger and understood. Tomorrow would not permit silence. The tension would arrive fully formed tomorrow, dragging past and present into collision. The threshold was here, and she would have to decide whether to step forward into disclosure or retreat into a silence that could no longer hold. The fifth morning broke with clear skies beyond the glass walls of the hospital. But within the cardiac unit, the atmosphere was brittle, like porcelain balanced too close to an edge. Nurses moved efficiently, IV lines were checked, medication schedules adjusted, and the smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. Yet, beneath the practiced calm, Sienna felt the tightening coil of inevitability. Silence could not shield her much longer. Adrian's recovery had advanced more quickly than expected. He walked longer stretches with assistance. His voice had grown stronger, and his appetite had cautiously returned. Yet, progress only sharpened his urgency. He no longer asked tentative questions. Instead, he prepared to demand answers that would change the course of every life tethered to this ward. When she entered his room that morning, he greeted her with quiet intensity. The usual polite inquiries about blood pressure and heart rate passed quickly. But then he fixed his eyes on hers and said he would not let another day pass without the truth. Were the children he had seen in the lounge his? His voice was low, steady, and deliberate, but beneath it lay the force of a storm that had waited years to break. The monitor above him betrayed his rising pulse. She placed a hand on the bedrail, reminding him of the fragility of grafts and sutures, urging calm. Yet the insistence in his expression told her that calm would only follow disclosure. The conversation was cut short by Marina's arrival. She swept into the room carrying her tablet, her eyes sharp with calculation. She greeted her husband with staged tenderness, then turned her cool gaze on Sienna. She asked about his progress, when he would resume leadership duties, and why his vitals spiked during visits. Every word carried the weight of suspicion. Sienna answered with clinical precision, never once breaking into personal territory. Marina seemed dissatisfied, her eyes narrowing as if she were tracing cracks in a wall. She lingered too long, then departed with a final glance that promised the questions were far from finished. In the hallway afterward, Dr. Patel intercepted Sienna. He had sensed the mounting tension, though he did not know its full measure. He reminded her of the ethics committee's scrutiny, of the hospital's reputation, of her own career. He urged caution, but he also acknowledged the strain she carried. He offered to take over primary communication with the family again. She thanked him, yet knew some truths were beyond delegation. Proof of concept in medicine was protocol, evidence, and outcomes. But proof of concept in life was blood and memory, and no colleague could hold that for her. By afternoon, the children arrived again. Ava carried a sketch of fractured glass, bound together with light. Theo recited mathematical riddles, proud of his precision. Miles read softly from a story about travelers searching for their true home. They clustered around her in the family lounge, unaware of the storm gathering just a corridor away. Their presence filled the space with warmth and innocence, but their resemblance to Adrian was now undeniable to anyone who cared to look. Sienna's heart ached as she embraced them, caught between protection and inevitability. Adrian, attempting another walk, passed by the lounge at that very moment. He stopped mid-step, his eyes fastening on the children with a look that mingled wonder, sorrow, and recognition so complete it could not be mistaken. The nurse urged him onward, but he stood frozen, his gaze following every detail. The silence that had shielded the truth for years was no longer tenable. Proof had crossed the threshold from suspicion into certainty. Back in his room, he confronted her again. His voice was raw, yet unyielding. He told her he had seen enough, that denial would insult them both. He described the curve of Ava's chin as identical to his mother's. He spoke of Theo's analytical speech, a reflection of his own childhood self. He noted Miles's gentleness, a trait once dismissed in himself, but alive in his son. His words trembled not with anger, but with desperation. He asked again if they were his. For the first time, Sienna felt the walls she had built falter. The silence that once protected her children now threatened to crush them with unanswered questions. She reminded him of his cruelty years ago, of the word barren hurled like a weapon, of the abandonment that left her to carry 3 lives alone. He closed his eyes, the memory pressing against him heavier than the sternotomy scar across his chest. He whispered that he had been wrong, that he had been blind, that he had destroyed the only real family he ever had. He begged for truth, not for himself, but for the children. He said he could not live with the thought of dying again without knowing them. Her voice faltered, but she finally acknowledged what blood had already proved. Yes, they were his. Ava, Theo, and Miles were his children. Born months after he discarded her, raised without his presence, nurtured through her sacrifice. The silence was shattered in that room like glass finally breaking. Adrian wept quietly, the monitors steady, but his body trembling. He asked what they were like, who they were, what dreams they carried. She told him piece by piece, her voice blending pride and pain. He listened as if every word were both gift and condemnation. When she finished, the room fell quiet. The weight of years lay between them, a canyon carved by cruelty and absence. Yet within it pulsed the undeniable fact of 3 children whose lives bound them still. The truth was no longer a concept. It was reality, fragile and dangerous, demanding to be reckoned with. Sienna left the room, her composure cracked, her heart pounding with relief and dread. In the hallway, Marina waited, suspicion sharpened into certainty by the tension on both their faces. The breaking point had arrived. Silence could no longer hold. Proof had stepped fully into the light, and with it came consequences none of them could escape. The 6th day of recovery began with the illusion of calm. The hospital ward hummed with its ordinary symphony of wheels on tile, monitors pulsing in steady rhythm, and the clipped exchanges of nurses handing over shifts. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, lending a fragile warmth to rooms that often only saw pain. Yet beneath the surface, silence had reached its end. The fractures that had spread quietly for days were now widening, threatening to break everything open. Adrian was stronger, the color returning to his face, his steps longer, his voice steadier. Yet the strength of his body only magnified the urgency of his mind. He had heard the truth from Sienna's lips, confirming what his eyes had already known. Ava, Theo, and Miles were his children, not figments of suspicion or echoes of resemblance, but flesh and blood, born in the shadows of the life he had abandoned. The knowledge pulsed through him with every heartbeat, stronger than any graft or artery. When Sienna entered his room, she found him sitting upright, waiting, not for medical updates but for her. His gratitude for survival had shifted into determination. He asked again to see the children, not as shadows glimpsed through glass but face to face. She hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect and the duty to acknowledge what had already been uncovered. She reminded him that their lives had been built without him, that they did not yet know the truth. But he pressed harder, his voice trembling with both desperation and regret. He could not live another day in his absence. Proof had been named. It demanded presence. Their conversation fractured when Marina arrived. She entered with a smile sharpened by suspicion, carrying perfectly arranged flowers and words too carefully chosen. She noted the tension between the surgeon and the patient, and her eyes narrowed. She asked questions that carried hidden barbs, wondering why her husband's condition seemed tied to particular visitors, why the surgeon's children were so often nearby. Sienna deflected with clinical calm, but Marina was no longer satisfied with silence. Her instincts, honed by years of guarding her social standing, told her that something more dangerous than illness was unfolding. After Marina left, Adrian turned back to Sienna, urgency burning in his expression. He spoke of regret, arrogance, and the cruelty of words that had driven her away. He begged not for forgiveness but for the chance to be present, to learn who his children truly were. He described his emptiness, how boardrooms and gala halls had never filled the void left behind. His voice cracked as he admitted that survival meant nothing if he could not stand before the children and tell them he was their father. The rawness of his confession unsettled her, because beneath it lay a truth she could no longer ignore. He had changed, not enough to erase the past, but enough to beg for something real. Evening descended, The children were in the lounge again, their laughter filling the sterile air with life. Ava showed her sketch of a fractured heart bound by light. Theo explained his puzzle about infinite numbers. Miles read softly about explorers who found their way home after being lost in darkness. Adrian passed the lounge during his walk, his eyes fixed on them, as if every step carried him closer to absolution. A nurse tried to guide him back, but he resisted long enough for his gaze to hold theirs. Ava noticed and tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Proof had now crossed from suspicion into recognition. The boundaries of silence were dissolving. He confronted Sienna with the quiet force of inevitability in his room. He told her that secrecy could no longer serve anyone, least of all the children. He reminded her that they deserved truth, not half shadows and silence. She argued that truth could wound, that revelation could tear apart the fragile stability she had built. But he answered with clarity. Lies wound more deeply than honesty. To deny them their father when he was alive was another form of cruelty. His words struck harder than she wanted to admit. Night settled over the hospital, but within Sienna's office, the storm raged. Ava's sketch lay open on her desk, the fractured heart shining with lines of light. Theo's equation scrawled on paper beside it spoke of order hidden in chaos. Miles's story, left half finished, told of travelers finding home only when they acknowledged who they truly were. She stared at the artifacts of their innocence and felt her defenses collapsing. Proof of concept had once been silence, control, the belief that she could protect by concealing. But now the proof was undeniable, alive, demanding consequence. The truth had stepped fully into the open, and the breaking point had already passed. What remained was choice, whether to... The cardiac unit carried on with its steady pulse, medications delivered, charts updated, nurses moving briskly. But the air felt charged, heavier than oxygen within Adrian's private room. Truth had been named. What remained was confrontation, not only with the past, but with the future that demanded recognition. Adrian had grown stronger with each passing day. He stood longer, walked farther, spoke with more authority. Yet none of those gains mattered as much to him as the presence of 3 children who bore his reflection. Proof lived in their eyes and in their laughter. No clinical report could deny what was already carved into his heart. He wanted to see them, he tried to claim them. And he wanted to confess to the damage he had caused when he once pronounced their mother barren and unworthy. Sienna entered with her usual composure, but today her steps were heavier. She checked his vitals, adjusted his chart, and offered instructions. Yet her silence carried more weight than her words. He waited until she finished, then told her plainly that secrecy had done its work and now threatened to undo everything. The children deserved to know him. They deserved the truth. His voice shook not with weakness but with conviction, and for once she could not deny it. She told him they had lived safely, free of the legacy he had abandoned them to. He answered that safety without truth is another form of exile. Before their words could settle, the door opened. Marina entered, her smile polished but her eyes sharp with suspicion that had ripened into certainty. She spoke of upcoming events, obligations that waited beyond the hospital walls, but her words quickly sharpened into accusations. She demanded to know why her husband stared at the surgeon with such intensity, why the children of this doctor were so frequently nearby, and why his recovery seemed tethered to their presence. She turned her gaze on Sienna. Her voice was edged like glass. What exactly bound her family to this patient? Silence stretched until it could no longer hold. Adrian spoke before Sienna could. He told Marina that Ava, Theo, and Miles were his children. The words struck like thunder. Marina's composure cracked for the first time, her face pale and rigid as the foundation of her life shifted beneath her. She demanded proof, demanded explanations, demanded denials, but Adrian did not falter. He admitted his arrogance, his cruelty, his abandonment. He confessed that the children existed because of Sienna's strength, not his own, and that their lives were the only proof that mattered. The monitors ticked steadily behind him, as if to underscore the truth with each beat. Marina's voice rose, sharp and trembling, calling the revelation betrayal. She accused Sienna of scheming, of withholding, of engineering revenge. Sienna stood tall, her voice even but firm. She reminded Marina that her only duty here was medicine, that she had not orchestrated fate but endured it. She declared that the children were not pawns in any battle of legacy, but human lives who deserved respect. Her words carried the authority of both surgeon and mother, and for a moment, even Marina could not answer. The confrontation ended with Marina leaving in brittle silence, heels striking the corridor like fractured glass. Adrian collapsed back against his pillows, drained but resolute. He reached for Sienna's hand, not with entitlement, but with humility. He asked not for forgiveness, but to stand before his children and tell them who he was. She hesitated, torn between fear and inevitability, then told him the decision would not be hers alone. The children would have their own voices, and their future must be shaped by truth, not concealment. That evening, the children returned to the lounge. Sienna guided them gently into a private room, her heart pounding. Adrian waited there, standing with effort, his hospital gown replaced by simple clothes. The children entered cautiously, their eyes wide. For a moment, silence filled the space. Then Ava stepped forward, her sketchbook clutched tight, her eyes searching his face. Theo tilted his head, already piecing together equations of resemblance. Miles looked quietly, his gaze carrying a depth beyond his years. They did not need words to know. Proof was written in every feature they shared. Adrian knelt slowly, his voice breaking as he told them he was their father. He spoke of mistakes, of pride, of blindness that had cost him 9 years he could never reclaim. He promised nothing grand, only to spend whatever time remained proving that he was worthy. He traced the lines with trembling fingers, tears falling freely. Proof had found its final form, not in words or charts, but in the bond standing before him. Sienna watched from the doorway, her chest heavy with fear, pride, and something like release. The silence she had lived by was gone. The truth stood in the open, fragile but alive. Proof of concept had been tested, fractured, and finally transformed into proof of life itself. Whatever storms lay ahead, the boundaries of silence had been broken.